Hello everyone. Welcome to our podcast channel. Welcome to Language Unlocked, the podcast where we explore the fascinating world of languages and communication. I'm your host, Alex. Today, we're diving into a common yet often misunderstood phenomenon, the ability to understand a language but struggling to speak it. Joining me is Dr. Emily, a linguist specializing in second language acquisition. Welcome, Dr. Emily.
Thanks for having me, Alex. I'm excited to discuss this topic.
So, let's jump right in. Many people experience understanding a language quite well, but they find it hard to speak it fluently. Why does this happen?
It's a fascinating issue. This phenomenon often occurs because understanding and speaking a language are processed differently in the brain. Comprehension is generally more passive. You're taking in information and making sense of it. Speaking, on the other hand, is an active process that involves quickly recalling vocabulary, constructing sentences, and pronouncing words correctly all in real time.
That makes sense. Is there a difference in how these skills develop?
Absolutely. When learning a new language, listening and reading skills often develop faster than speaking and writing. This can happen for several reasons. For one, listening and reading often involve recognizing words and phrases that you've already learned, while speaking requires you to actively produce those words, which can be more challenging. Additionally, many language learners may have more exposure to listening and reading materials than opportunities to practice speaking, especially if they're learning the language in a non-immersive environment.
That's interesting. So could this also explain why someone might understand a lot of what's being said in a conversation, but struggle to contribute verbally?
Exactly. Understanding what's being said can rely on contextual clues and partial comprehension, while speaking requires a fuller grasp of grammar and vocabulary. Moreover, the fear of making mistakes can inhibit people from speaking, even if they understand what's going on. This anxiety can create a mental block, making it even harder to speak fluently.
That brings up an important point. Confidence. How does confidence play into this issue?
Confidence is crucial. If you're constantly worried about making mistakes, it can paralyze you. Many people feel embarrassed or frustrated when they can't express themselves as well as they'd like, which can make them avoid speaking altogether. Building confidence often requires a supportive environment where making mistakes is okay and seen as part of the learning process.
What can language learners do to improve their speaking skills and overcome this dilemma?
One effective strategy is to engage in more speaking practice. This could be through language exchange programs, conversation clubs, or even talking to oneself in the mirror. Another tip is to start with small, manageable goals, like ordering food in a restaurant or asking for directions. Gradually increasing the complexity of your conversations can build both skills and confidence.
Those are great tips. What about technology? Are there any tools that can help?
Absolutely. Language learning apps often have speaking exercises that use voice recognition to provide feedback. Virtual reality platforms can also simulate real-life conversations in a safe environment. And let's not forget the good old-fashioned method of watching movies or listening to music in the target language, which can help with pronunciation and intonation.
Fantastic insights, Dr. Emily. It's reassuring to know that this is a common issue and that there are practical ways to improve. Before we wrap up, any final thoughts?
Just a reminder that learning a language is a journey, and it's okay to have ups and downs. The important thing is to keep practicing and not be afraid to speak, even if it's not perfect. Communication is about making connections, not perfection.
Let's explore this topic further. We've talked about the difference between understanding and speaking a language. Can you explain how the brain processes these two skills differently?
Certainly, the brain has distinct neural pathways for different language functions. Comprehension, which involves listening and reading, generally engages the temporal lobe, particularly areas like Wernicke's area, responsible for understanding spoken and written language. Speaking, however, involves Broca's area in the frontal lobe, which is crucial for language production. These areas must work together, but they specialize in different aspects of language.
It's amazing how specialized our brains are. So, can a person have strong comprehension skills, but weak speaking abilities, because these areas develop differently?
Exactly. Many learners may develop strong comprehension skills, especially if they spend a lot of time listening to the language, like watching movies, listening to music, or attending lectures. These activities primarily strengthen passive vocabulary and understanding. However, if they don't actively practice speaking, the neural connections in the brain responsible for language production may not develop as robustly. This imbalance can make it challenging to transition from understanding to speaking.
That makes sense. It reminds me of how we often learn to understand before we can articulate our thoughts, even in our native language.
Absolutely. The concept of receptive versus productive language skills applies here. Receptive skills, like listening and reading, generally come first, followed by productive skills, like speaking and writing. This is a natural part of language development, but it can become more pronounced in a second language, especially if there's a lack of speaking practice.
You mentioned earlier that anxiety and fear of making mistakes can be significant barriers. How can learners overcome these psychological hurdles?
Overcoming these hurdles often involves a shift in mindset. One of the most important things is to embrace the idea that making mistakes is a normal and essential part of learning. Perfectionism can be a huge barrier. Learners need to understand that fluency is a journey, not a destination. Engaging in low-pressure speaking situations, like casual conversations with friends or language exchange partners, can also help. It's crucial to create a supportive environment where learners feel safe to experiment and make errors.
Speaking of creating a supportive environment, what role do language teachers and tutors play in this process?
Language teachers and tutors can play a pivotal role. They can provide constructive feedback and help learners focus on areas that need improvement without discouraging them. Effective teachers also use a variety of methods to encourage speaking, such as role-playing, debates, and group discussions. The goal is to create a classroom atmosphere that fosters confidence and reduces anxiety.
Let's talk about the practical aspect of practicing speaking. What are some everyday activities learners can do to improve their speaking skills?
There are many practical activities learners can incorporate into their daily lives. One simple method is to think aloud in the target language, narrating daily activities as you do them. Another is to record yourself speaking and then listen back to identify areas for improvement. Joining a language exchange group or finding a conversation partner online can provide valuable practice. Additionally, practicing with native speakers or even using language apps that simulate real-life conversations can be incredibly beneficial.
It sounds like immersion, even in small doses, can make a big difference.
Absolutely. Even if full immersion isn't possible, micro-immersion experiences, like watching movies without subtitles or listening to podcasts in the target language, can help. The key is consistency and making language practice a part of your daily routine.
You mentioned technology earlier. Could you elaborate on how learners can use technology to enhance their speaking skills?
Technology offers numerous tools for language practice. Apps like Duolingo, Babbel, and Rosetta Stone provide interactive exercises that include speaking components. Some platforms, like Tandem or HelloTalk, connect learners with native speakers for language exchange. Additionally, virtual reality VR technology is becoming increasingly popular for language learning, offering immersive environments where learners can practice speaking in realistic settings. These tools can be especially helpful for those who don't have easy access to native speakers.
It's incredible how far technology has come in supporting language learning. Before we wrap up, do you have any final tips or encouragement for our listeners who might be struggling with speaking a language they understand?
My final piece of advice is to be patient with yourself. Language learning is a marathon, not a sprint. Celebrate your progress, no matter how small, and remember that every mistake is an opportunity to learn. Keep practicing, stay curious, and most importantly, don't be afraid to speak. The more you use the language, the more confident and fluent you'll become.
Wise words, Dr. Emily. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your insights. It's been an enlightening conversation.
Thank you, Alex. It was a pleasure to be here.
And thanks to our listeners for tuning in to Language Unlocked. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review. We'll be back next week with more fascinating topics in the world of languages and communication. Until then, keep learning and don't be afraid to find your voice.